Before we get into the video, I would like to thank some Patreons who contributed to the channel. We're Spy TF2, Ozzy Zero, Kid Named Finger, Thomas Haynes, Tulip Mango, James Westbrook Jr., Sean Lugo, Soup for Days, Silent, and Emerald Henry. Thank you all for contributing to the channel. Patreon link is in the description if you would like to support the channel. Anything helps and you'll be eligible for benefits based on any amount you give. Hey. I think the title of this is pretty straightforward. In this video, I will be ranking the teams of Total Drama. And usually when I do tier list videos, I like to try and create some more metrics for how I rank the specific things I'm talking about. I feel like it's a bit easier to synthesize what I'm actually looking into. And for this video, I'm going to be ranking these teams based on 3 different factors. First is star power. That's pretty self-explanatory. It's just the overall popularity, relevancy, interest of the characters on any given team. Next, I'll be factoring in relationships, which is, again, also pretty self-explanatory, how people interact with each other on the team, how complex and diverse they become, maybe how they contribute to character arcs or the overall season. And lastly, will be team dynamics. This one's a bit harder to explain, but essentially it's who's at the top of a team, who's at the middle of a team, who's at the bottom of a team. Is there multiple alliances to a team in the middle that has to choose a side? Basically, what's the structure of the team format? Is there a structure to the team format? And how diverse and interesting is that team dynamic? I feel like that covers all the things I'm going to go into, so without wasting any more of your time, let's rank our first team, the Screaming Gophers. Now, before we get into this, I just want to say I'm not actually even sure how many teams will make it into the F tier. Pretty certain that none of these teams are going to fall really into F tier based on the usual metric I use for tier lists. So I've altered it kind of in this video. If you don't know or remember what my old ranking really is, just briefly I'll go over it. F is you caused disenjoyment for me. D is I didn't care about you. C is you were okay, you weren't that good, but you weren't bad, and I still have an opinion about you. It's just not that positive. B is I think you're pretty good. A is I think you have all the right parts. And then S is I think you have all the right parts and interesting parts. But that's more where personal bias starts to rank you a bit higher. But for teams, it's a lot harder to rank for bad, because I think even bad teams I wouldn't put into F, because even bad teams have something to offer. Like, if a team is a complete train wreck, I still think they're interesting to watch. Like, I think a train wreck is an interesting thing to experience. So even if they're a team that I think is bad, maybe has like bad dynamics or just like really stupid, I'd still probably put them in like D, because I think bad things can be interesting, especially your teams, because it's really hard to have the bad team in a team setting, because even if there are people in a team I don't like, usually there are other people going against those people in the team, which means to some degree I like those people. So that whole rambling answer, basically all I'm trying to say is that D and F are essentially inverted in my mind for this tier list, because again, if you're like actually a team that I think does a lot of bad, I actually don't think you're like worthy, you know, you still offer some entertainment. So you actually go into D, which in this case now is like representative of F in that you are a bad team that does something wrong. It's essentially now C tier, except D is for teams that are actually bad, like they have bad stuff going on, but I still like them a little bit for the bad stuff. So that's where D falls in this now. Then F is teams that I think are just completely boring, that have absolutely nothing going on, and I don't care about them. Screaming Gophers. First, I will talk on their star power, which I actually think is probably one of the best star powers of any team in Total Drama. Really surprising for a team that has 11 contestants. It's really hard to have 11 contestants in a team that all feel likable and all have interesting stuff. Even the early boots from this team in this season, Justin and Noah, go on to have pretty impressive showings in later seasons and become likable characters in their own regards. And if we're factoring in Island as a whole, I think most of the big names from Island are on the Screaming Gophers. You have Gwen, you have Heather, you have Owen, you have Lashana, you have even like more minor characters but still really loved, and Lindsay and Trent and Cody. Trent and Cody, really the only two from this team I think aren't really like the most star power filled options are Beth and Izzy, and even both of them have a lot of fan in their regards, and I don't consider either of them to be bad characters. So this is a very decked out team for star power. When it comes to relationships, I don't think it's a bad team. I do think there's interesting relationships going on. You have some very big ones that are parallel throughout the entire season, like Gwen and Heather, Heather and Lashana, Gwen and Trent, Lindsay and Heather and Beth. You have a lot of interesting relationships that have large impact on the characters and a large impact on the story. So that's also a very good thing for the Screaming Gophers. But team dynamics is where this team drops down a lot in my mind. there is never really a well-established top to this group. There's never a really well-established bottom to this group. There's not even really a middle. And most of that is due to Heather's plot armor. Because people who are against Heather, like Gwen and Lashana, are people who you'd think are at the top positions of this team, but they aren't because they never get out Heather. Heather kind of always gets her way, even though she should constantly be in the bottom. In Justin's Build episode, she has a confessional saying like, me and Lindsay and Beth voted for her, and then I just convinced Owen and Izzy, and she hardly really explains how. She's just like, yeah, I got them too. Which does not make any sense, and then you maybe think like Owen and Izzy are in the middle position, but then it's never expanded upon. Like Owen and Izzy never even have meaningful interactions moving forward, except for Owen with Heather all the way until the merge phase. Feels like there's a lot of votes here in the pre-merge for this team that are kind of like one-off deals that just kind of happen. They don't happen because Perman was consistently on the bottom. They just happen because like one specific thing happened in the episode that made them not really someone that the group wanted to stay in a vote setting. Cody was a one-vote situation. He wasn't on the bottom, but then he got mauled by a bear, so he got voted out. Beth was a one-time vote situation. She wasn't on the bottom. Then she had to curse idol, she got voted out. So there's no real good understanding of who's on the bottom of this team. Really, the only team dynamic worthy thing on this team, which is a very big thing, is Heather's alliance with Lindsay and Beth. But that's it. And really, that kind of devolves and breaks down into more just relationship stuff, because obviously the alliance blows up when Beth wants to leave, and then her uses Lindsay and breaks up that alliance at the merge. So even that team dynamic aspect kind of fades into obscurity. So while this team is very good on star power and very good on relationships, I'm not crazy about the team dynamics, and I do think it's a great team, and I almost want to put it up into S just because I really do enjoy this team, but I just feel like the team dynamics has to reflect it a little bit more, so I am going to put them into A tier. Next, we have Killer Bass. This team, weirdly enough, is a pretty solid invert of Screaming Gophers. First, we're going to talk about star power. This team has some really big heavy hitter characters. You have Duncan, you have Courtney, and you have Harold, but really I think that's kind of where it ends. I mean, DJ, Bridget, and Jeff aren't bad characters, but their later showings aren't that much more impressive. These season showings aren't that impressive, and while they do have their fans, I don't really think they're big Eshla characters. You do also have Tyler on this team, who becomes a very prominent fan favorite in World Tour, but even then, I still don't think Tyler's really in that discussion of really great characters, because he only has one season he did even remotely well in, and besides those characters, you have some really big duds that don't ever get used again or really talked about. They're pretty minor in the star power aspect. You have Ezekiel, you have Eva, you have Katie and Sadie. This team, again, while not having bad star power, I definitely think is carried by the few really big names that it has. Relationships, Duncan and Courtney, Jeff and Bridget, Harold and Duncan. I guess you got Harold, Duncan, Jeff, and DJ for when they were all bullying him. Then you could also add DJ, Jeff, and Duncan just as a trio themselves. But it really feels like all of those relationships obviously factor in on themselves. I guess there's also Katie and Sadie, but I don't give a shit about that relationship. Both the star power and relationships are definitely lesser on Killer Bass compared to Screaming Gophers. I still don't think they're bad at all. They make up for it a lot in team dynamics. There is a very, very clear top to this team. There's a very, very clear leader in this team with Courtney. There's a very clear top with Duncan, Courtney, DJ, Bridget, and Jeff. They are always at the top of the vote. There's always people at the bottom getting kicked out that make sense to getting kicked out at the bottom, and well, it is also because it's an island season, kind of similar to Screaming Gophers, where it's like they make a big mistake, which is why they get voted out. It's also kind of obvious that those people that get voted out were never like in a position of power, or never even really like in a middle position. Katie and Sadie never felt like top players or middle players who had a lot of connections that got screwed over when someone else should have got voted out. Like, it made perfect sense why they went when they did, because they weren't well insulated or connected to anybody. And you also have a scrappy bottom in Harold, who is someone you'd think would get voted out a lot sooner. It doesn't. And I do like team dynamics where a person on the bottom is able to last a lot longer than they should. And I think when you're comparing the team dynamics, especially to Screaming Gophers, this team feels a lot more nuanced and a lot more interesting when you're examining the votes. And this is another thing I just like about this team, is that they're a very prominent underdog team in their season. They're probably one of the most prominent underdog teams in all of Total Drama. So while Killer Bass has lesser in relationship and star power, they make up for it with really good team dynamics. I think they're really like the only team on this entire show that's like an underdog team. I guess you could say Team Victory, but their underdog implies that they succeed and overcome adversity, which they did not. So I do think Killer Bass is a really good team, but I don't think I put them in S tier, mostly because of Katie and Sadie. And I do also feel like they're missing out on some crucial parts, but I would personally put them over the Screaming Gophers because I do think they're a lot more nuanced than interesting. Next is the Screaming Gaffers. Star power, this team is completely decked. You have Heather, Duncan, Lashana, Gwen, and Harold all on one team. Those are 5 massive names, and even though DJ is the lesser of those names, he also has a lot of fans and isn't a dud of star power by any means. One of the most decked out teams when you're looking at star power alone. There are massive names here, super influential to the plot, and super well beloved and recognizable. I do think relationships is the lowest point in this team, but that's mostly just because the team is very small, a minimal number of relationships. They're very big relationships. 2 of the biggest relationship dynamics of this entire season in Harold and Duncan's rivalry, and then Harold and Duncan and Lashana as an alliance. Now outside of that, you still do have some interesting minor relationships between Harold and Heather and how they interact. Lashana and Harold still navigating their sort of relationship. As a whole, even just think as a whole, this team bounces off each other so well. They have so much bickering, they have so much fighting, but they also have a lot of collaborative moments and a lot of iconic moments. This team as a whole, in the way they interact, which when I say that I mostly mean Duncan, Heather, Harold, and Lashana, because Gwen and DJ are really boots, but between those 4, they make the action pre-merge very enjoyable. They're one of the biggest highlights in every episode for the action pre-merge. Their team dynamics is where I think this gets a bit iffy, but even then, I do still think there's established top with Harold, Duncan, and Lashana having their alliance controlling a lot of votes, Heather being an extremely unliked figure still working from the bottom, and I even like how the top of Lashana, Harold, and Duncan is one that fights a lot when Lashana's secrets about how she kind of used the cast and talked bad about them at times spewed out. I do like that there was a little bit of the conflict and fighting of people supposedly at the top of the team. I think that's a really nice detail to look at when you're considering the nuance of those team dynamics. So they're going to be the first team I give an S tier. I don't really know where they land in S tier yet, if it's like a high or a low or a middle. I do think it's on the lower middle spectrum, mostly just because it's such a small team that it's hard for them to have a ton going on. But even with that, I do still feel like they manage to be very entertaining and very interesting. So we have the other team on action, Killer Grips. This is coincidentally, again, like Island, going to be a pretty set inverts of this team. Star power is definitely not the worst team. Kind of like a Killer Bass, but to a much lesser degree. You do have some big names in Lindsay and Courtney, and especially Justin more so in this season. And I guess I should mention, with talking about Courtney here, that for these teams, I am going to be including people who get switched onto teams. That's going to be a lot harder when we talk about other teams. But for now, it's pretty simple that we're just going to include Courtney on the Killer Grips discussion. Anyways, you have Courtney, Lindsay, Justin, 3 very big names for the season. But that's kind of it. I mean, you do have Beth, but this is my tier list, and I've never been big on Beth, even though she's a winner of this season. I don't feel like a lot's done of her character. I don't think she has a lot of iconic or even memorable moments that aren't just like her assisting to other characters' arcs like Courtney and Lindsay and even Justin in the really early pre-merge. I don't think of her as a big character on her own, but you have those ones, and then you have Owen and Izzy, which again are like fine. I definitely think Owen was a much bigger presence and an enjoyable presence on Island. Here he just kind of falters. He definitely loses a lot of star power and doesn't feel nearly as important. Izzy's just a weird character, just kind of there, but she doesn't really do anything, and she gets voted out twice in the pre-merge. Just kind of exists there to have some episodes to get someone eliminated that doesn't really matter, so I don't feel like she really matters in that whole scheme. And when you look at their relationships, I just don't think there's a ton here either. You have Lindsay and Beth, which is very prominent. You have Owen and Izzy, but even then, I don't think they do anything new with their relationship in this season. I'd argue they were much more interesting in Island. Even in Island, I still don't think they did a ton with their relationship, but here in action, they just kind of coexist and have a couple scenes every episode. Not nothing, it's worth mentioning, but not crazy. And outside of that, I don't think there are any other relationships that are really worthwhile talking about. I think you can make a debate for Courtney and Lindsay in the post-merge, and maybe like Justin and Courtney in the post-merge. But when we're looking at the team dynamics, and especially relationship dynamics with teams, I'm mostly talking about dynamics that get established heavily in the pre-merge. Because if I'm talking about just post-merge, like what characters interact, that's kind of more just about the character and less about this team. So really lacking in relationships and team dynamics, it's a mess. It's a mess the entire time until Courtney comes into frame. Sadly enough, I actually think Trent is the most interesting part of the team dynamics up until that point, which also says a lot about this team considering Trent got eliminated really early. But the fact you have this person who's, kind of a de facto team leader, but ends up churning and then start trying to throw challenges, and then you have Justin figuring that out and using it against him, switch with him to then kind of create a group. The issue is that his group included everyone on the team, so it wasn't really an alliance as much as it was the group just against Trent. But that is still a team dynamic of the entire group turning on their leader, but But then that was it until Courtney came. Nothing of nuance or important happened. All they did in that time frame, have Izzy come back and then Izzy get eliminated. There was no other vote. I guess there was like Justin kind of being at the top of controlling Beth and Lindsay, but then becoming ugly, so kind of falling out of power. But he wasn't really using that power besides the Trent vote anyways, so it doesn't really matter. But once Courtney comes, I do think the team dynamics get at least manageable, where there's something for us to talk about, where Courtney is again inserting herself as a leader, and even though she's at the top of a leader position, she's still kind of on the bottom because nobody really likes her, and I think that's an interesting dynamic. But this team just doesn't go to elimination ceremony enough in interesting votes. Team dynamics is really lacking. The star power is there, but it's not that great. And the relationships are pretty baseline and minimal, so this will be the first team I give an F tier. I really just wasn't that entertained by this team. I do think it has its moments. When you look overall for a team that had, like 17 episodes of a pre-merge to create interest, there's very few moments that I can point to. Next, we are going to be talking about Team Amazon. Star power, you obviously have three big names of Heather, Gwen, Courtney. I think Sierra and Cody are lesser than those three, but I still don't think they're poor star power characters when you look at them in this season. Sierra definitely has her moments. She makes it pretty far. Cody definitely has his moments. He makes it pretty far. I wouldn't consider anybody on this team a dud, but I also wouldn't consider the star power anything like groundbreaking. You know, the relationships are always harder for smaller teams, but similar to the Screaming Gaffers, I think this team bounces off each other super well. I love how Gwen and Courtney and Heather are really bickering all the time early in the pre-merge, but then kind of started getting to the groove of things as they compete in more challenges, and even though they still really hate each other, they're able to coexist and actually work pretty well together. And as much as I don't like the love triangle plot, I do think Courtney and Gwen have their place for a relationship on this season when you're looking at how they interact before Duncan and then interact and break apart after Duncan. But another tough thing about this team is you have the relationship of Sierra and Cody, which I think is one of the grossest relationships to watch unfold on screen. It's just straight up Cody getting sexually assaulted and it constantly being thrown off as a joke. So I think that sours my opinion of their team's relationship a lot. Team dynamics is really hard to assess because this team hardly goes to elimination. I think they actually only go to one elimination. No, technically they go to the Amazon one where they try to vote out Heather pretty early on, but they go to very few eliminations. But even with that, I still did really enjoy watching this team interact with each other. Again, in the challenges where there's not really an established leader, because the three girls, Courtney, Gwen, and Heather, bicker with each other all the time, it's all kind of become like co-leaders working together. Once Heather is very clearly at the bottom for most of pre-emerge, but then once Gwen and Courtney have their falling out, then you have Courtney actively trying to throw challenges against the team. You get Gwen out, you have Gwen trying to get Courtney out, which now switches Heather's position from the bottom to a middle position, also trying to work with Cody and Sierra. Like, I think those parts of the team dynamics are very interesting. I just think it's hard to truly assess them because we don't get to see a lot of tangible ways it plays out because they don't go to elimination as much as they should. But still, a very solid team. I just don't quite put them in the S tier because, again, this team dynamics are just a little bit lacking, and the relationship stuff with Sierra and Cody definitely sour my opinion of how this team interacts, especially when you're just looking at like outside of just how Sierra's treating Cody, which is obviously terrible, but you look at the ways like Heather and Courtney and Gwen are just dismissing it. Like, yeah, it makes this team a bit iffy to me, so I can't put them in the S tier because of that. Next we have Team Chris is really hot. Star power, a very strong team. Alejandro, Tyler, and Noah are probably three of the biggest like heartthrob characters for the total drama community. You're very hard pressed to find many people who don't like even one of those characters. Owen and Izzy are definitely more variable, but I think on this team they bounce off really well and have a lot of shining moments. Despite in Izzy's case not even making it that far, I still think they're really good characters on this team, and when you hear people talk highly about Izzy and highly about Owen, they do often point to this team specifically to talk about how well they worked with this team. So I don't even consider them duds. Would probably even consider them higher in the echelon than I do like Sierra and Cody, comparing them to Team Amazon. Relationship, again, always a hard one to do with smaller teams. There's not nearly as much interconnected stuff happening, but you do still have some really big relationship. Alejandro and Owen and Noah. Oh, I forgot to talk about Duncan because Duncan also joins this team later. We had Duncan's on this team later, and then you have Duncan and Owen, Alejandro and Duncan, Izzy and Owen, Izzy and Noah and Alejandro. There's so many moving parts of relationships. My only big complaint is that Tyler kind of just floats around in the relationship aspect of this team. He doesn't really have anything going on for any of the other teammates. Besides that, there's really strong and really versatile power relationships on this team. Team dynamics also has a lot of nuance. Again, kind of has an issue with Team Amazon early on that they don't go to elimination nearly enough to see who's clearly on the bottom. You know, you can clearly tell Alejandro is at the top because everybody loves him, but you don't really have a clear idea of like who he's targeting or who he's trying to work with to vote out other people, because just kind of being friendly, good for everybody, and then nobody else, at least at that point, seemed to really care about the game. I was realizing later that Noah was aware of Alejandro and seemed to just kind of be taking a step back, but was taking the game seriously. It's just early on that's hard to tell. But once Noah gets outed for having seen Alejandro for what he was and Alejandro taking out Noah, then team dynamics get a lot more clear and interesting. You have Owen kind of put on the bottom immediately after that because he was partnered with Noah, but then you have that bottom switching Duncan once the secret Gwen come out. Then you have a switch again to Tyler once he's kind of becoming too much of a challenge hindrance. So you have very quickly in 3 back-to-back episodes, 3 people who are on the bottom switching, and none of them are Alejandro, which does establish again Alejandro is very clearly the top of this team, and he's kind of deciding who his middle is. And that makes Duncan's part in the team dynamics very interesting because he's aware of Alejandro's power, which is why once Tyler gets eliminated, he tries to work Owen. So now you have Duncan and Alejandro split as the 2 sides, and Owen being the middle. And all of those like changing team dynamics I just explained was over like 5 episodes. It's crazy how nuanced dynamics of this team get super quickly. So they're another team I'm putting in S tier, and I do think I put them over the Screaming Gaffers, only just because I think this team manages to have every part of it working at its maximum of all time. Even Tyler, who's not part of the relationship dynamics as much, is still a very interesting character, whereas the Screaming Gaffers, pure gold with Heather, Harold, Lashana, and Duncan. Gwen and DJ are definitely a lot more floaters in this team. There's not even really a single floater I can serve in this team. Maybe Izzy, but even then, I still think she serves her purpose, especially in a way of like getting eliminated right before Noah needed her. Like if she stayed, the team dynamics could have completely changed because Noah could have had the numbers, or at least had the numbers to tie a vote if he was able to keep Owen and Izzy. So her, in a way, getting eliminated even contributes to the story. So this is a very, very good team. Now we're going to talk about Team Victory. This is going to be pretty short. Star power, you do have a couple big names. You got Lashana, you got Lindsay, you got Harold, you have DJ. Bridget, again, kind of like in a weird place where I don't consider her equal to those people really, especially on this season, but she does have her fans. I guess same sort of thing of Ezekiel, but to even a lower extent of Bridget. Not bad star power, but the issue is even if those big names like Harold and Lashana, they aren't on this team for very long. They don't do a lot in this season, so their star power isn't nearly as impactful in this specific team. Relationships, there's hardly any because the entire team gets eviscerated. Really, you just have DJ and Lindsay, which was a cute dynamic of them being the last 2, like we have each other, we're in this together. But besides that, I can't really think of any other one. You kind of have like overall team relationship dynamics when you think of how the team turns against Ezekiel for messing up, and maybe how like Harold sacrificed himself for the team. Those are very minor compared to what team relationship dynamics are supposed to be. A little bit of grace for this team just because it's honestly hard to have team dynamics when your team is a duo. And also inversely, when we're talking about team dynamics, there is not much here. Really the only thing to talk about is that DJ was like on the bottom, but he wasn't really on the bottom because he always stayed longer than he should have because he kept wanting to go but he couldn't. But it is an interesting team dynamic that he was kind of on the bottom and then he's the last surviving member and he's, I guess in a way, the top of the team. He's by himself, but he's also kind of the bottom in the middle because there's no one there. He's not even really at the top, he's just kind of the baseline. But really DJ is the only one we can even really talk about. I don't think Lashana or Lindsay are people I'd really consider the top of this team. They didn't really have a lot of influence. All the people were just kind of on their own. I guess there was a short bit when it was Lashana, Lindsay, and DJ where Lashana kind of took over as leader, but that was also the same episode she got eliminated, so didn't mean a whole lot. This team really is a big train wreck, but this is where what I talked about at the beginning of this video comes into effect because even though they're a bad team, like all the factors objectively say they did really bad, they failed the objectives, but it's entertaining. They're the only team that's ever just lost so much that they have to be disbanded, and I think that in itself does boost it up into D tier. It's definitely not even the most interesting in the way that it just gets completely assassinated. It loses its charm pretty quickly, especially when it doesn't develop to anything further of like DJ actually just being the last member, persevering really far. He just has like 1 episode for that and then gets eliminated. I do like a little bit, but it's mostly because of how terrible they performed. Next is the Toxic Rats. So the original Toxic Rats consists of Scott, Lightning, Stacy, B, Dakota, Dawn, and Sam. Then Brick gets added onto it later, and then Joe gets added onto it later. And I don't quite know how to rank them into this team. Because I do also believe Brick's a pretty big part of the maggots, and I want to consider him there, and it's kind of weird to count somebody who switched onto another team. So far, when we talk about someone who gets onto a team later, it's Duncan between Chris and Courtney with the Killer Grips. They're both people who weren't on teams before. So something like this definitely gets a bit harder when you're considering star power. And the only way I could really think to do it is that I am going to factor in Joe and Brick, but I am just going to factor them in less so to teams they were on for shorter time. So I'm going to factor Brick more heavily for Toxic Rats because he was here on this team longer than the maggots. I'm going to factor Joe here, but it's just on a much smaller scale because she was only here for about 2 episodes. So, when you look at star power of this team, I don't think it's amazing. I don't think it's nearly as good as some of the previous star power of teams we've talked about before, but I don't think it's a bad team. You do have some really good names here that people think of very highly. You have Dawn, you have Bee, you have Scott, you have Brick, and even the other characters in Sam and Dakota are not very poorly received characters. They're definitely not the highest of characters, but they certainly have their fans. Really, the only dud on this team is Stacy, and she is a very big dud, so I do think she harms the star power, but I don't think it's nearly enough to discredit all the very good names and interesting characters that are present on this team. Relationship-wise, I feel like this might be one of the most lacking teams in relationship, especially when you look at the impact the relationships have further into the game. Because you do have a very poignant one with Sam and Dakota, but they're hardly in the season. Dakota only makes it 2 episodes and just acts as an intern for the rest of the time. Sam only makes like 6 episodes. Like, their impact on the season is very minuscule. And even most of their bonding as a relationship doesn't happen with Dakota on the team. It happens with Dakota as an intern, so I don't even really know how much you count that in of a team dynamic. If it happened when someone wasn't on that team, that's more of an inter-team or intern relationship dynamic, which is all new over cameras, try we up. But like, that's the biggest one. And I do think there are some other interesting ones. I really like the short-lived rivalry of Scott and Bee. I really like the relationship between Scott and Dawn, where they're kind of at odds for a bit, but then they work together at times, but then Scott ultimately has to turn on her to protect his own game. I thought those were really interesting relationships. Again, as I said before, none of those relationships really factor into the game long-term, even long-term into the pre-merge, because everybody just keeps getting cut off. And as we talked about Team Victory, it's very hard to have those relationships very present when a team just keeps losing over and over. So in that lens, I am a bit generous in how harshly I judge Toxic Rats for this, especially now that I'm actually also remembering that Brick and Joe were a dynamic on this team, which is one of the best dynamics I think of this season and possibly the show. Team dynamics is a pretty weird task with this team. I do think there's a very established top, and I actually do think there's a pretty dead set middle. You have a top with Scott, and you have a middle, which for the most part of the pre-merge was Lightning and Sam. They were always involved in the groups that Scott would go talk to go put the vote against. The bottom people of the team dynamics on this team were usually short-lived because this team went to elimination a ton, so you have Dakota on the bottom because she's not taking the game seriously. She gets eliminated. You had Stacey on the bottom because she was a mess and now casting herself. She gets eliminated. These bottom people of the teams don't really get to make it that far, but there are still a lot of those people who I think aren't insulated. And then when you have someone like B get eliminated who was insulated, it's in a really interesting dynamic that got the entire team to flip on him. I think that's a really interesting prospect of someone who is very well received by the team, getting that flipped through someone else doing the work to sabotage them. And he also did it with Brick. And then when Scott got switched with Joe and Brick had a really interesting dynamic of both trying to be top of team and then Liming being the middle between those two. This team does have, I think, a good handful of team dynamics, and especially interchanging team dynamics with how much it goes to elimination and how much Scott plays a massive role in it. If Scott wasn't on this team, definitely would have a lot less team dynamics, but he is here and he causes a lot of fluctuation through stuff like that. So I actually think where I'm putting it to assess it for this time being is a good place for it. I really do like it at B. Again, the star power isn't as good as the other teams we're talking about. Relationships are not the most impactful, but again, when I'm being generous there of that, because it was team dwindling, so it's hard to have a lot of meaningful, long-lasting relationships, and the team dynamics were pretty solid, it could probably find itself up to an A if it was able to last with those relationships a lot longer and a lot more meaningful capacities, and if the team didn't have Stacy. Next, we are going to talk about the mutant maggots. I don't really believe I have a lot of opinions on this team. When it comes to star power, this team doesn't have anyone I'd consider a dud on this season, because all these people made it pretty far. I know people aren't like a massive fan of Cameron, but even he still has his fans, and as a character on this season, he has a lot going on for him. He's definitely a very big focal point of the competitors as he moves through the post-merge and early pre-merge. You're looking outside of that, you have Brick, who's well received, you have Joe, who's really interesting, Mike and Zoe definitely have their fans. When we're talking about them more prominently in this season, they don't get ruined yet in all stories, so for here, they're still a very enjoyable presence. Landry floated around and had an elimination that was pretty lackluster for her character and kind of just existed to be an obstacle with Vito and Zoe. She was a very well-liked character with very good moments. So again, I don't know if I'd quite consider this team in the same star power echelon of other teams we talked about before Revenge of the Island, but I do think it's pretty close. The team is pretty decked, and there's not anybody I'd definitively define as dead air on this team. Relationship-wise, this team is completely stacked. You have Zoe and Mike, you have Zoe and Mike and Cameron, you have Cameron and Joe, you have Cameron and Anne-Maria at a time, you have Anne-Maria and Joe at a time, you have Anne-Maria with Mike, you have Anne-Maria with Zoe, you have Brick Joe for the short time he's there, which again is one of the best relationships of this season. There's so many good moving relationship dynamics on this team. And then when you have Scott come onto the team, you have Scott, Cameron, and Mike, where Cameron and Mike are very trusting of her, but you have Scott and Zoe very close together, and I guess I'm also considering Dakota's or this. No, she's such a minor part of this team, but she is still there, and then she has dynamic with Zoe. Like, this team, I think, is probably the best team we've seen of any relationship dynamics, and most of them do end up finding their way into the post-merge in meaningful capacities. Obviously, the Anne-Maria's ones don't really because she gets eliminated, but Joe and Cameron's a very big one for Joe's elimination. Mike and Zoe's obviously a big one for them getting together, and Zoe turning into Commander Zoe. Zoe and Cameron's a big one for this friendship finale they have in the final three. The season almost feels like it's solely centered around these relationships, so this team definitely has one of, if not the best relationship dynamics we're going to talk about with any team. And I think it also is very solid when it comes to team dynamics. I like that you have Joe and Brick at the top fighting for leadership position initially, something we don't see a ton of teams where two people want to be the leader and have to kind of fight it out. And sure, it kind of is short-lasted because Brick surrenders that in episode 3. They still have their issues. It isn't like Brick just gives up on being the leader. He obviously still wants some power, and that's revisited on the Toxic Rats. When they end up getting on a team again, he establishes himself as the leader this time. This team becomes difficult when you look at trying to see if there's really a bottom. The only person you could say that definitively for is like Anne-Maria, because technically her only connection was with Vito, which isn't Mike. Unfortunately, we don't really get to see her getting voted out in a full capacity to confirm she was on the bottom of this team. The leader dynamics of this team alone were very captivating to watch. And I also liked how even though Joe was a leader to this team, the team didn't always agree with her. In fact, most of the time the team didn't agree with her, and it felt like Joe was always kind of in a hot seat for being the way she was, because I don't think we get a lot of leaders who last very long doing that. Like, most of the time that's rubbing people the wrong way and then they get themselves screwed over by acting like that, but Joe was able to actually pull it off for the entire P-merge. So I think that's a very unique thing to say about the leader of this team, just something we don't see very often. So I would put this team, I don't think it's quite S tier for me, because the fact I'm considering this much tells me that there's something missing from it. Probably just like the lack of eliminations, the lack of team dynamics playing out more. And I also think while the relation stuff was very prominent with like Mike and Zoe and the Anne-Maria stuff, I think it was much at times and also kind of felt unimportant. But I do think it's still a really good team, and I am going to put it at the top of A tier. Next, we're going to talk about a very uninteresting team to me. Heroic Hamsters. Star power for this team? In the dirt. This is an all-star season, and this team really lacks on this star power. Because even though you have characters that I do think were big at time, like Mike and Zoe, again, are characters that I do consider star power pretty positively for Mew Maggots, I consider them pretty negatively for Heroic Hamsters, because they're not very interesting characters, and while I do think they're focal points, I don't think they're focal points that people like, which overall make them a net negative, because a lot of people weren't a fan of Mal, me included. A lot of people weren't foul how Zoe kind of ignored that all, me included. This is my tier list. So Mike and Zoe, even though I'm trying to be like objective about inserting my opinion, I do think I'd still put them as an overall net negative, even if it's not much, because again, they still do have a lot of importance on the season. When I consider just like how boring and annoying they make the season, I definitely don't feel they're star players. Outside of Mike and Zoe, you have Sierra and Sam, which is like, why are they here? They are not all-stars enough, and not even really heroes enough, and neither of them do really anything of interest their entire time here. I mean, they have a couple moments, but they're two characters of this team that I would consider duds. Lindsay is also a character, again has very big star power in other seasons, but she does nothing here. Now she is an interesting character to see on the cast, when you first look at it, not knowing how poorly she does, so I wouldn't consider, I guess I consider her a net negative still, but it's just not as much as Sierra and Sam, who I'd call her a straight out dud, but she doesn't offer anything to this season. And then you have Cameron and Courtney, where Cameron, I do think I'd say net positive. I do like what he does with Gwen later, but that's kind of tough because that's more of a fill in his vultures thing, actually, and he doesn't really do anything on this team except for being, oh god, I completely forgot about the Cam Odie. So yeah, no, that's gonna be more relationships thing. So yeah, I think I'd also put him at a net negative. And then you have Duncan, who joins later, also kind of a net negative with star power, where he just completely obliterates any credibility he had as a cool character before being a complete loser mess. Really, the only positive star power on this team is Courtney. She's on it for so short. She doesn't really interact with this team that interestingly. The only interesting thing I really think she does is use Sam as a human shield, like as a really villainous and cowardice display, which instantly gets removed to the other team later that episode. So there's very little to appreciate the star power of this team. I think it might be one of the worst star powers of any team. Relationship dynamics, obviously there's Cam Odie, which I just remembered, so that fucking sucks. And then outside of that with this team, I don't really feel like there's a whole lot more to talk about. Zoe and Mike as a connection of trying to figure out Mike's personalities, and then Zoe feeling a bit off about him. You have Zoe and Duncan and them talking about Mal and him trying to convince her and be a bit friendly, which I think is actually a pretty good dynamic. I wish it was explored a bit more because it kind of ultimately just means absolutely nothing, especially in the prospect of Zoe trying to figure out Mal and completely ignores all the things Duncan was telling her. So ultimately that comes out to nothing. Outside of that, I can't think of any other meaningful relationships on this team. And team dynamics, oh god, I don't think there's anyone I'd really consider a leader of this team. I guess you could kind of say a Zoe and a Mike, but even that, I wouldn't say they're at the top of this team. They weren't really the top of the votes. They were just kind of there. Bottom, I guess you would say, is definitely Sam and Sierra, so there's a bottom there. Middle, I don't know, Cameron, but Cameron is also kind of a top. Duncan is a middle, I guess. You can kind of see the outline of what the dynamics are, but they're really not prevalent in any meaningful way when it comes to votes and team decisions and the way they interact in challenges. All of what I've just talked about with Heroic Hamsters is such a dud team. They are very boring. And the ways in which they are bad, which is like what I say of Team Victory, that they were bad because they lost so much, but I think that was interesting the way they lost so bad. The way that Heroic Hamsters is bad, like the Cam Odie stuff and the lack of relationship dynamics and character assassinations, is not a fun thing that makes me like them a little more, like how D in this tier list is supposed to represent. So I put them into F tier, and I think I put them at bottom of F tier. I'm not sure if anybody will even get close to them, because they fail on every metric I have created for this tier list. Next, we are going to rank the villainous vultures. I think this team easily had the potential to be one of the best teams of this entire show. But I think we're going to find out while talking through that it did not turn out to be that good. Star power, very good. There's not a single person on this team that I think you'd have an easy time of finding someone who dislikes them. It doesn't mean they don't exist. Like, I've definitely heard of people not being a big fan of Scott. There are definitely people not being the biggest fan of Lemming. But for the most part, this is very well received by fans. This team has a lot of importance on the season. And even early boots like Joe, I think, play an interesting role in shaping how this team moves forward. Really, her being so antagonistic towards Heather is what opens the door for Heather to still kind of act as a leader for the short time she remains. So this team has really, really strong star power. Even still including Cameron, who comes in later. But again, I'm factoring in less because he wasn't there as long. Relationships, there's only like 3 relationships I can think of off the top of my head. Cameron and Gwen, which I did actually quite enjoy, as I said before. I think it was fun to have those two characters interact, and fun to especially have it in this villainous setting where this innocent bubble boy is coming. You have someone helping him out and not being manipulated by all these evil people. Heather and Alejandro in that very short spiel where they worked together for a bit, but then ultimately turned against each other in a really gravitas elimination. So I did enjoy revisiting that and having them fight. My only complaint with that is that I wish it lasted a bit longer than just mainly that episode. And then you have Courtney and Scott. I don't think is a bad couple. Like, I quite enjoy them. I think the issue I have with them is that all their scenes in the pre-merge kind of just felt like the same scene with a different hat on. You don't really meaningfully progress that relationship in the P-merge. It's basically just Scott being like, I like a bossy woman, and then Courtney being like, oh god, I think I like Scott. And then you just like show that a little bit differently every time. It doesn't really get added onto, and then also what happens with it later in the season where Courtney makes a list and they end up breaking up completely because of that, because Scott cared so much about him being drawn as a rat. It's like that relationship ultimately didn't really matter that much. And outside of those relationships, I really don't think there's, I guess there was Gwen and Duncan for when Duncan was here for the short time. Oh, and there's Gwen and Courtney, which was making up, which is actually a pretty good one, but again, also the Scott thing, it ends up not mattering. But that was a good relationship. I do think that was a good thing to revisit. So I don't think the relationships here are completely horrendous. I just think they're very minuscule. When you look at the teams from seasons besides All-Stars, this team, I think, lacks very strong relationships that are not nullified or soured by a stupid chart Courtney makes. But regardless, team dynamics, there is quite a lot of movement team dynamics here because everyone here is obviously a schemer because they're a villain. I think Alejandro, Heather, and Joe all really early on butter up to Gwen to have all the power was an interesting story to tell. Kind of, again, reminiscent of Mirror Magus between Joe and Brick, where you have multiple people earning for the leadership and the power on this team. Joe and Heather also have that in the episode before, which I wasn't as big a fan of, but I do think it's worth noting the extended part of the leadership here on this team. And I also think it's interesting how the leaders all kind of fail. Joe gets eliminated, Heather gets eliminated. Alejandro never really firmly cements himself as a leader, so I think that was all really interesting, because I don't think we have many teams I can point out where the leader figures keep getting themselves cut off because that's a team that doesn't really value them that much, or it's a team where Alejandro is able to play an idol and get Heather eliminated. So I also think that was an interest in contributing to unique team dynamics here, of someone getting eliminated who didn't have majority vote. Obviously a whole different aspect in the game itself. With the team, I also think that interacted a whole bunch. Cameron coming onto the team, kind of being at the bottom, but then still working with Gwen. The team dynamics are definitely here, and I like this like yearning and like inter-team political play. You're trying to butter up certain people you need to have power. It's one of the few teams in Total Drama where it really feels like everyone's trying to play an angle, at least at one point or another. Maybe not Scott, but really it's just him on this team. So I do think I like this team. But again, the ingredients here are ingredients for a team that easily could have been an S-tier team, but I definitely don't think it's there. And I think I'd probably just put it at like bottom of B. It's just an okay team with solid star power, but besides that, I don't think there's anything else here that's monumentally worth mentioning. It's just like okay around the board, with definitely some interesting moving parts. Next, we have the floating Sam and Salmon, however you say it. I think you're going to see a trend for the Pacatero Island teams that the star power is slim, to keep it brief. There's not a whole lot here with this team when it comes to star power, and what's sad is that I still think it's better than the team we're going to talk about in a second. But when you look at the cast for this team, there are quite a few people that I'm just not the most impressed with, and I would to a certain degree consider them duds. You have Rodney, who is a very apparent dud. You have people like Max and honestly Amy and Sammy, who both had the opportunities to be very good characters, and I don't think Max is a completely useless character. I do think he serves a purpose and he has fans, and he's not even the most unbearable person on this cast. So I think all those three do have their fans and have their moments. But then you also have Scarlett, who isn't a dud, but is a very terrible character of how she's played out later. Topher really isn't that noteworthy. Again, I wouldn't consider him a dud. He does have his place and his moments. But overall, I don't think I've ever heard anybody say Topher's their favorite character, or even like a top one of their characters. Really, the only good, heavy, star power worthy contender on this team is Jasmine. She's a really solid character, but she's kind of it. I feel like everybody else is just bad or meh or upper meh, but overall the star power on this team is not anything to be impressed by. Relationships, I also feel like there's not a ton going on with this team, at least in super noteworthy stuff. I do think there are relationships that I like on this team. Obviously, I really enjoy Sammy and Jasmine. Scarlett and Max is a weird dynamic that I do think can be annoying at times, but overall it's an interesting dynamic we haven't really seen with anybody else in the show, of two people working together to do evil, where one's completely delusional and then one's actually doing all the work. Sammy and Amy, I do think I kind of like their dynamic, not in the sense of like I agree with what Amy was doing to her, but I do think it was an interesting dynamic to have a pre-existing relationship going into the game that's actually extremely negative and manipulative, as opposed to like Katie and Sadie or Rain and Raj, where it's a really closely knit duo. It's actually a duo of people where one's being extremely manipulated and used, so I think that's really different. But That's all there is to talk about in this team. And those are really solid relationships. I enjoyed them on this team, but it's just not the most expansive list of relationships. The only other ones to even kind of mention are like Rodney and then the girls that he has a crush on. I don't know, maybe Max and Jasmine for a short bit there, where like Max was challenging her leadership. I guess that was something. But really, those three are the main ones you think of this team. And again, they're not bad relationships, not the worst thing I've ever seen. They're just a little bit limited to me. Team dynamics, I do think there's stuff going on here. Don't really find it the most interesting. Jasmine's very clearly at a top position. Bottom is kind of weird. I don't feel like there's ever a super clear bottom, except for people who get eliminated in the episodes that get eliminated in. You know, Sammy at a time is at the bottom. Then she takes over as Amy and then finds herself in a high position on the team. You have obviously a bottom with Rodney where he outcasted himself. Max has a bottom where he's just this really weird character, cost his team a challenge and the team was gonna vote him out. I feel like that's kind of my issue with all the bottoms on this team. All of them are kind of similar to like a screaming gopher bottoms where it's just someone messes up an episode, now they're on the bottom. There's not a lot of continuity between who is like on the outs of the team. It really just feels like Jasmine's at the top and then Scarlett's pretty solidly in the middle for basically all the pre-merge. Besides that, I just don't think there's a lot to talk about. Like, the team dynamics are there. I don't think they're impossible to see or possible to theorize about, but I just think they're not that interesting to examine. About everything I've said for this team so far is kind of just meh. Like, I don't think it's a bad team down here. Have an opinion on this team. I do like some of the characters on this team. I do like the moments of this team, but overall it's not a team that I'm crazy about. So this is the first team we're going to put into C tier. Next, we are going to talk about the Confused Bears. Star Power? This might be one of the worst teams we've ever seen for Star Power. I know I've said that a lot for some of these teams, but this one genuinely has so many characters that are so weak. Leonard and Beardo are right off the bat immediately duds to me. I don't think there's anything noteworthy about these characters. I don't think you could find basically anyone in the fandom who like actually enjoys them. Sugar was a pretty annoying character that a lot of people didn't like. Dave became a completely horrible character, one of the worst characters in total drama to me. Emma is, I think, just fine. I've never been a fan of her. I know some people like her, but overall when I look at what she's done and what her purpose was and really how well she just worked as a character, none of it was very impressive to me. Sean and Jasmine are the only two that I think are actually decent characters on this team. Even both of them I think I have a lot of problems with. They are very focal to the season. I do think they work for Star Power. It's just that they're not characters I'm exactly crazy about, and that might just be because of the plotlines to get themselves logged into and Sean being a zombie obsessed character for so long, which became redundant to me quickly. But I don't know. I do think Sean and Sky aren't bad Star Power characters. Like, if this entire team was made up of people like Sean and Sky, I'd say the Star Power was decent. But the fact that Sean and Sky are the high of Star Power on this team, I think really speaks to how horrendous a lot of these characters are. When it comes to relationships, I actually do think there's a lot of layers for this team. You have Sugar and Ella, you have Sugar and Ella and Leonard, you have Dave, Sean, Sky, you have Dave, Sean, you have Dave, Sky, and like Dave, Ella, and while I'm not a big fan of all those relationships, especially how they get expanded upon as we continue into the season, there is at least a lot to talk about here. I do think they're quite interesting and unique relationships to look at. I don't think the execution on Ella and Sugar's relationship was the best, but I do like the idea of a one-sided rivalry between two people, which is something we really haven't seen on Total Drama yet, so that's pretty unique in itself. Definitely not a fan of how Dave and Sky turned out, but again, it is a unique relationship. I feel it is a dating plot, but I think what no one could say about Dave and Sky as a couple is that they're a simple couple. There's a lot of issues going on there, annoying issues going on there, which I think make it quite unique. So the relationships are definitely there, but you know, not very good. And the team dynamics, I definitely don't think are in the same way of Star Power relationships where they're there and they suck. I actually think the team dynamics of this team are pretty well centered. You have a very, very clear top of Dave, Sean, and Sky, a very strong alliance that always do seem to be kind of the deciding factors. You had the very clear bottom of Beardo, and then I think more so comes Sugar once Beardo and Leonard are gone. And to speak of the Leonard vote, you know, Leonard's not a great character, but I do think the dynamics of that team when Leonard was there, while not the most interesting like for television, are interesting when you're examining the team dynamics of the fact that both teams kind of break straight down the middle. Sean, Sky, and Dave are the voices of reason, realizing how stupid this is that we're, you know, entertaining the idea of a wizard. But then you have Leonard, Sugar, and Ella being the more imaginative cuckoos of the group, actually believing in that sort of stuff. And I think it pitted Leonard and Dave against each other really well. And while Leonard is not a great character, I do think having those moments of a team butting heads with each other is something I actually feel like we surprisingly don't get that often. And especially on something we get that often where both people butting the heads actually have like some sort of power in the game. So this team is definitely weird. There's a lot of bad stuff. But again, this is why I did the switching of D and F, because this is objectively a very bad team. There is a lot here I don't like of them as a team. And it's so bad I'm almost considering putting them into F, disregarding the fact that F's just supposed to be kind of for boring teams because they're that bad. But I definitely do think this team, as painful as it is to look at sometimes, is a train wreck, and is a train wreck that I do think I enjoy watching at times, especially when I'm establishing them just as a team in the pre-merge. If I'm ignoring all the stuff that happens in the post-merge and I'm just looking at this team as a team, I do think they were fun to watch at times for how terrible they were. So I'm going to keep them at a D, but I do think it's important to know it's a very, very, very low D. Talked about it at the beginning of the video of why I switched the D and F, being the fact that it's extremely hard to have a team that I can actually view as an F of like overall just being really unenjoyable with the star power and really unenjoyable with the relationships we see and really unenjoyable team dynamics. Like, it's really hard to have a team do that because a team is a cohesive unit of a lot of people working together, and it's really hard to have an entire team of just bad characters and bad relationships. And I don't even know if you really could have bad team dynamics without them just being boring and non-existent. But this team actually comes pretty close to just having really bad metrics and all of that. They can get themselves up at least to a D, because I do have a lot to talk about with them. And now we're going to move on to the reboot seasons. I'm going to try and go a bit quicker because I think I wasted a lot of time with the Confused Bears. Next is the Frog of Deaths, and this is a good team to go quicker on because I actually think, I don't know, because I don't think people talk about whole drama teams that often, but I consider this to be a really overrated team. I don't think it's a bad team. If we look at the star power, I don't think there's that many people who I'd consider to be bad on this team. In fact, you have some pretty big hitters in Julia and MK and Bowie, and the Hockey Bros. Emma and Caleb are, while not amazing characters, again, I do think they have their own fans, lower echelon but still not bad characters. But then you have Nichelle, who in this season and even the next season, if you want to be that generous to consider it for this team ranking, is a complete dud. She doesn't really do anything. She has basically no meaningful connections. She does have a semblance of character progression, but it's very short-lived and very uninteresting. So they do have a very clear dud, which isn't enough to fully taint the star power. The star power here is very strong. But we're going to move on to the further stuff. This is where I think you'll see this team isn't really that impressive. Relationships to talk about, and there is not a ton of unique relationships here. And when I say that, I actually just mean there are relationships, but it consists of just about the same four people. There's Rain and Raj, there's Raj and Bowie, there's Emma and Bowie, and that's about it. All of them consist either Bowie or Raj, and then you have people like Julia, who has no meaningful relationships on this team, MK, who has no meaningful relationships on this team, Caleb and Nichelle, who were early boots, but neither of them had meaningful relationships on this team. And then even if you're looking at Emma and Wayne, their only meaningful connections were to Raj and or Bowie. And the relationships I just listed are really good relationships. I think some of the top relationships of this season, but they're too minimal. And I don't like how this team feels really sectored off in what people are uniquely interacting with each other. So relationships, I don't think I'd call them bad. There is good stuff there, but I wouldn't consider them good. I'd consider them neutral, and that's me being generous. And same sort of thing for team dynamics. I do think there are dynamics here. The issue is I think they're just kind of set in stone from the beginning, and then nothing really ever changes. I think Bowie is very much at the top because he's able to switch the vote onto Caleb, and Bowie being on the top kind of invites Emma and Wayne and Raj into a not official alliance, but basically an unspoken alliance of all these four people working together, which then puts Julia and MK on the bottom. And then that's just kind of it. Nothing really changes from that point. MK and Julia don't do anything to change the structure of the team dynamics. They just don't lose enough that they don't have to deal with it. Hell, they do lose, and then MK and Julia have their fight at each other and that happens. But the team dynamics, are very clear. You see the blueprints, you see how it's structured, but it never gets challenged in any interesting way. And it's also kind of an issue just with the reboot seasons that the P-merge is really short, so there's not a lot of opportunity for anything interesting outside of that to occur. I don't think this is a bad team. Again, the star power is definitely there, even if the shell is a dud. The relationships, while neutral, still do have something to offer. The team dynamics are boring, but at least they're clear to see. So I do put the Frog of Deaths into the upper tiers, but not any higher than what I'd consider a pretty low B tier. Next, we are going to talk about the Ferocious Trouts. Star power, I think I'd consider this team worse than Frog of Deaths, but overall still fairly solid. I think the issue is I don't have a lot of big names on this team that are very widely loved by a lot of people. Like Millie and Priya are the big names of this team in this season, but I don't think they're the kind of names that most people love. Like a lot of people like Bowie, a lot of people like MK and Wayne and Rod, like a lot of fans like those characters. I don't think Priya and Millie are in that same regard. I definitely think there are people who like them, but it's a lot more minimal where I don't consider them super high tier star power players when you think of them like that. And on top of that, this team also has Ripper and Chase, who, while I don't consider either of them to be duds, I do think they have a lot of personality and they do offer a lot to the season. I don't consider them good characters. I don't consider them enjoyable characters. And again, this is my tier list, so I know some people like them. I don't really like them. I do think they have a place and they don't interfere with the star power too negatively, like not nearly as much as a dud like Nichelle would. They definitely don't help the star power a ton. Damien, Axel, Scary Girl, I also feel like are not bad characters for sure. I definitely think they, well, maybe Axel, but Scary Girl and Damien I do think have their place and definitely have their fans. And then you have Z, which is actually I think the only character I'd really consider from this team to be a good star player, because I think he serves his purpose as a character perfectly and I think a lot of people like him. The star power of this team is just really messy. There's not a lot of big names, but I also don't think there's a lot of duds. But I would consider the star power of this team probably lower than the Frogs of Death and probably even lower of a team like Floating Salmon, so not very impressed on the star power. In relationships, there is a lot of good stuff going on. You have Priya and Millie, you have Priya, Millie, and Damien, you have Priya, Millie, Ripper, you have Damien, Scary Girl, you have Ripper, Chase Z, you have Chase Z, you have Ripper, Chase, you have Axel and Ripper for a short period of time that she was there. Like, I feel like everyone here feels pretty strongly connected to at least one other person, except for maybe the exception of Axel and Scary Girl, who kind of have more one-off connections with Damien for Scary Girl and Ripper for Axel. Besides them, I think everybody else is really well interconnected with this team. Minusing those two and talking about the other six, I feel like all of them interact with each other at least once in a unique and interesting way. The way this team bounces off each other I find very addictive, and it honestly gives me a bit of reminiscence of the Screaming Gaffers. I definitely think the Screaming Gaffers do it a lot better because I think the way they interact with each other is consistently more entertaining, but in the sense of a team where everybody feels like they are a part of the team and interacting with each other in unique ways, where most of the time it does feel like on every team there's at least one person who isn't nearly as connected as much. This team definitely has that point of like you lose a couple of people, then everybody else that remains feels super connected onto the team. So relationships are really good there. The team dynamics for this team are also pretty solid. While I don't think it's as apparent with the top and middle and bottom, I think it's more so due to the fact that this team is very unique in what it's constantly wanting. Ripper is kind of a top figure in the sense that he is a leader on this team for some of the challenges, but he's always pretty consistently at the bottom whenever the team goes to vote because he's so antagonistic, and I think it's kind of an interesting reminiscent way of like sort of Jo, where Jo is the head figure of her team. Her team didn't really like her at all, and whereas Jo had that dynamic but her team never really went to elimination with her, Ripper goes to elimination of his team multiple times, and you get to see how his team kind of weighs the benefits and cons of keeping him. Priya and Millie feel like a pretty well established top, and I think Chase and Z definitely work as a middle. Team dynamics here are differing in a lot of ways, and while I don't think it's the best team dynamics we've seen on the show, I definitely don't think they're lacking in team dynamics. So this isn't a bad team, and I do consider them better than the Frogs of Death, and I do consider them better than the Villainous Vultures. I consider them better than the Toxic Rats, but I don't think I can see them quite being in the A tier just because the star power is super shaky, but the relationships are super on point. The team dynamics have a lot to offer, so I do find them at a very high B tier. And looking at this list more, I actually think I do consider the Me and Maggots to be S tier. The more I look at it, I feel like they should be there. We will say it's a pretty low S tier, but I feel like they belong there. Next, we are talking about the rat faces from season season 2. So, start off that star power. There's not much of anything here. You have Nichelle, who I still consider to be a dud. You have Priya and Caleb, which again, like Priya and Millie on the Ferocious Trouts, are kind of the figureheads of the season, but not figureheads that a lot of people enjoy on this season. And I'd probably say they are a lot worse than Priya and Millie were on the Ferocious Trouts, because I do think Priya and Millie still had a lot of fans at that point, whereas Priya and Caleb, I definitely think most of the audience was tired of their plot pretty far into the merge. You have Millie, which again, kind of an iffy character, especially with what she does this season of kind of assassinating her credibility as a character and as a plot to have her do something so dumb that's so against the point that she learned in season 1. Damien and Axel, as much as I like Damien, I think both are still pretty meh characters on this team. I don't think they interact on this team very interestingly, and I think Damien was a lot more interesting in the Ferocious Trouts of what he was doing with trying to quit, but he just floats around the rat faces. He does hardly anything. Same for Z, same for Emma. Star power for the rat faces is extremely lacking. I'd actually say their star power is even worse than Ferocious Trouts, because at least Ferocious Trouts had interesting characters on the team doing things for that season. This team has hardly anyone who I'd consider to be a massive player that is beloved by a lot of people. Relationships, literally, I think the only one I can really talk about is Caleb and Priya. I think that's it for this team. I guess you have Millie and Damien too for that very short while, but I wouldn't really consider that a positive relationship, nor one that was very impactful. Besides that, I don't think I can actually even begin to think of any other relationships for this team, except for extremely minor relationships of like Emma and Priya for her elimination episode, where Priya's working her and they have a little fight back and forth. You have Z and Priya, with Z holding Priya's secret of her crush on Caleb, I guess, but even that's still just kind of connected back to Priya and Caleb. So Priya and Caleb's really the only big relationship to talk about this team, and that's a pretty sour and a pretty bad relationship that's especially pretty boring at this point in the season, which is fine. You know, it had a lot of build up, but the fact that that was the big relationship for this team, there's nothing else, extremely bad look for the relationships of this team. And as for team dynamics, I think it's kind of the same thing that I just said. Priya and Caleb are very clearly at the top. I don't even think there's a clearly defined bottom of this team to talk about. The only one I can mention is Millie, because Millie outcasted herself and got her on the bottom, so I guess that's something. But even then, that was a very short-lived team dynamic of her getting herself on the bottom and then getting eliminated for putting herself on the bottom. And I feel like just about everybody else was middle. They all kind of just listened to Priya and Caleb with no issues at all. So team dynamics are extremely lacking. There's not a whole lot to talk about. Relationships are pretty lacking. There's not much to talk about. And the star power was very weak. So I would consider this an F tier team. And I think I do consider it lower than Killer Grips. I do think I put it over Heroic Hamsters, for the only reason being that the rat faces only had a 5-episode pre-merge. That's a really short pre-merge to try and establish a team. So I'm going to be a little bit generous with them and put them above Heroic Hamsters, but I think both of them are extremely boring and lackluster teams. Last team to talk about, we have Skunk Butts. Now, same sort of thing I said for Frogs of Death. This team has amazing star power. Again, you have MK, Julia, Bowie, Wayne, Raj, even like a Ripper who I don't love. I do think a star power is better on this team than it was on the Ferocious Trouts, because he at least actually starts to develop linear plot, and he cuts down on a lot of the gross humor, which I appreciate. So even Ripper, who I still would consider like an elite star player character, I do think he's at least better than he was on Ferocious Trouts. Chase and Scary Girl are the only two that I think are kind of mad on this team, but I wouldn't even consider either of them complete duds on this team. I still think Chase had something to offer in the sense of being a martyr for Emma to use to eliminate, to prove that she's over him. Obviously, I wish Emma could have done more of that martyring, but at least Chase had a purpose to serve there, and his elimination episode was a funny way for him to get eliminated. Scary Girl came back and she had a great character on her return, and both of them were the first boots of the season too, so I give them some slack on that. It's like, if you're an early boot and you at least show some sort of character and do something at least kind of entertaining in the elimination episode, I give you some slack. So I wouldn't consider either of them duds, and the rest of the team being so stacked, it doesn't really matter. The star power here is very good. I would consider them just a little bit over the Frogs of Death when it comes to star power. Relationships, this team, again, I kind of like Frogs of Death, is really saturated with certain dynamics. You have Julia Julia and MK. You have Julia and MK and Bowie with them knowing the cheating. You have Bowie and Raj with Bowie knowing about the cheating and knowing it upsets Raj but not telling him. You have Rain and Raj and Julia and MK, where Rain and Raj feel bad about the cheating that Julia and MK are telling them to do. There's a lot of layers with those 5 contestants. Ripper is kind of just left on the outs of that. He doesn't really have anything going on with this team when it comes relationship-wise. I think that's my only real issue with the relationships. Obviously, Chase and Scary Girl didn't really have any relationships either, but again, the super early boots, you wouldn't really expect them to have a ton of relationships, so I don't judge it too harshly. I do judge it a little bit, but I don't judge it too harshly when it comes to stuff like that. Similar, again, to Frogs of Death, where it's like a couple people having all the power, but where Frogs of Death really was like Bowie and Raj were the anchor to the relationships, and then Emma and Wayne were kind of the branches. I feel like all the 5 people of this team, Bowie, Raj, Rain, Julia, and MK, are all anchors in their own regard. All of them have interactions with each other in meaningful, connected, expanded ways. Again, similar to a team like Screaming Gaffers and like Ferocious Trouts. Team dynamics is interesting because it's not very easy to establish, but I think it's good that it's not easy to establish because you can establish it. It's just that it changes throughout the pre-merge, which is what I think interesting team dynamics should do. If they just stay stagnant as one thing the entire time, that's pretty boring. So at the beginning, I definitely think the top of this team is Bowie, Raj, Rain, with Julia and MK on the bottom because that's literally why Bowie put them on the team. But after the first challenge, Julia's kind of able to get that bottom target off her by being more serious in the challenge. And then you have people at the bottom like Scary Girl and Chase who don't take the game as seriously or put people off more. And then I think once Julia and MK start interfering with cheating a lot, they kind of become the top of this team, with Bowie tagging along with that for a bit. But then the team becomes fractured when Bowie puts his foot down to support Raj and not cheating. And then you have Bowie, Raj, Rain against Ripper, Axel, Julia who want to cheat. The team, again, similar to like Confused Bears, where they break into 2 unique groups with power butting heads. The Skunk Butts do that. The team dynamics are definitely here, and I definitely think they're interesting. They're not perfect by any means, but I definitely think they're enough. So pretty stacked star power, pretty good relationships, kind of missing a bit in the team dynamics, but I still consider this a very solid team that I would put into A tier. I am trying to be generous with the fact that it was a 5-episode pre-merge, because 5 episodes is really short to have a pre-merge. Like, you're comparing this 5 episode to this like 13 episode. I feel like this one should be respected a little bit more. So considering that, I do think I'm going to put it. There you go, that is my final team tier list. That is ranking the teams of Total Drama, my tier list. I'm gonna be honest, I really don't know how to end this. I don't really know what to talk about. I guess tell me if you think this was an interesting video idea. I feel like teams are a really weird thing to talk about in Total Drama. They're so collective, there's so many parts to a team. It's not as simple as some of the other things that I've ranked. I especially think the metrics are hard to follow when you're considering the star power of a person for a team, but then considering it for the rest of the season, but then considering them overall as a character across multiple seasons, you're considering relationships mostly how they're expanded upon on pre-merge, but then also how do they get affected, whether it becomes better or worse post-merge. On team ranking video, I do think a lot of considerations go into the post-merge and how characters get affected there, a lot more than I thought it would when I first came up with the idea. I'm pretty content with my team tier list. I don't feel like when I look at it, I'm seeing anything that looks super off. When I look at the top teams, I definitely remember those as teams that I enjoyed watching. When I look at the bottom of the teams, I definitely remember them as teams I didn't enjoy watching. So, I don't know. Let me know if you agree with my ideas. If you don't and you hate me and you think I'm an idiot for doing it, whatever. That's all. Bye.